Paul Anderson was once seen as an ordinary father, the kind of man who blended into suburban life without notice, until the day he lost his job and within weeks transformed from provider to predator, leaving behind one of the most chilling family tragedies the town had ever seen. Paul Anderson had always been a man of routine. For nearly 2 decades, he woke at dawn, ate the same breakfast, and left for his job at the manufacturing plant where he spent long days among machines and noise. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave him the comfort of stability. His wife, Claire, trusted him to provide, and their 2 children grew up believing that life in their quiet suburban home would always remain steady. Then came the announcement no one expected. The plant was shutting down part of its operations, and entire departments were being eliminated. Paul's name was on the list of layoffs, and with one letter he lost not only his paycheck, but the identity he had built around his work. The news hit him harder than he allowed anyone to see. In front of his family, he forced a smile and spoke as though things would be fine. Inside, however, he was unraveling. The savings account was almost empty. Their mortgage payments loomed large, and the car needed repairs. At night, as the rest of the household slept peacefully, Paul sat at the kitchen table staring at overdue bills. Each envelope felt heavier than the last, a weight pressing down on his chest. He tried applying for jobs at other factories, but the economy was changing, and fewer places needed men with his skills. Days turned into weeks, and rejection became a constant companion. Paul found himself caught between pride and fear. He couldn't bring himself to tell Claire the full truth, afraid she would see him as a failure. Instead, he created a disguise of normalcy. Every morning, he dressed for work, packed his old lunchbox, and left the house as though nothing had changed. But instead of heading to the factory, he drove aimlessly through town, parking in empty lots, staring at strangers, and wondering how they seemed to carry on while he felt his world slipping away. Sometimes he sat in fast food restaurants, nursing a coffee for hours, pretending to be busy. Other times he lingered in libraries, flipping through classifieds that offered nothing suitable. The weight of his secret grew unbearable. He began to avoid friends and neighbors, ducking behind closed blinds whenever someone passed the house. The once friendly man who shared small talk over fences was vanishing, replaced by a quiet figure shadowed by worry. Claire noticed small changes, how he snapped when asked simple questions, how he seemed distracted even during family meals, how his eyes no longer lit up when the children laughed. The children themselves sensed something unspoken in the air, though they could not name it. What had once been a warm, lively household was slowly turning cold. Paul's mind worked tirelessly in circles, each thought darker than the last. He told himself he was protecting his family from panic, but in truth, he was isolating himself from the very people who loved him. Every unpaid bill reminded him of his shrinking control. Every day spent pretending reminded him that time was running out. What began as a single job loss was becoming something much bigger, a spiral that pulled him deeper into despair with every passing moment. When the foreclosure notice arrived, Paul could no longer maintain the illusion. The envelope, thick and stamped with urgent red letters, was impossible to ignore. Claire opened it first, her hands trembling as she read the words that confirmed her worst fears. The house, the one place that had always felt secure, was slipping away. That night, the walls of the Anderson home seemed to close in around them. Silence replaced conversation, and unease replaced the sense of safety the children had always known. Paul retreated further into himself, avoiding Claire's gaze, pacing from one room to the next, as though searching for an escape that didn't exist. He spent long hours in the garage, sitting on an old folding chair, staring at the concrete floor. The smell of oil and rust mixed with the faint odor of dust, a reminder of years spent working with his hands. But those memories gave him no comfort now. Instead, they seemed to mock him, whispering that he was a man who no longer had a place in the world. Claire tried to approach him, her voice calm but strained, asking what they were going to do. Each time, Paul brushed her off with vague reassurances, unable to admit that he had no answers. His pride clashed with his fear, and he let both build into an anger that simmered just beneath the surface. The children noticed the changes, too. They watched their father from the corners of their eyes, unsure of the man who once laughed with them but now barely spoke. They heard muffled arguments at night, the sound of footsteps pacing back and forth, and the creak of the floorboards above their rooms. They clung to small comforts, like cartoons on television or the warmth of their mother's hugs. But even those moments were tinged with unease. Something heavy lingered in the air, an invisible shadow that made the house feel colder with each passing day. Friends in the neighborhood began to see less of the Anderson family. Paul stopped waving from the driveway. Claire declined invitations she once eagerly accepted. When neighbors asked how things were going, Claire forced a smile, while Paul avoided eye contact. Their absence from church gatherings and community events raised quiet whispers, but no one guessed how dire the situation had become. From the outside, their home still looked perfectly ordinary, the lawn trimmed, the curtains drawn neatly, but inside a storm was gathering that no one could see. Paul's thoughts grew darker with each sleepless night. He replayed his failures in his mind like a film on repeat. The mortgage, the bills, the endless job applications, all stacked against him like a mountain he could never climb. He began to believe there was no way out, no future where he could reclaim his dignity. The shame of being unable to provide consumed him, and he started to view his family not as companions in his struggle, but as victims of his downfall. In his mind, their suffering became unbearable to imagine. And slowly, an idea began to take shape, first as a whisper and then as a steady drumbeat he could not silence. It was an idea that offered release, a final solution to the crushing weight pressing on his shoulders. He told himself it was mercy, even though it was something far darker. The night Paul decided to carry out his plan was colder than most. A thin frost coated the windows, muting the glow of the streetlights outside. Inside, the Anderson house was still. The only sounds, the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the settling walls. Paul sat alone in the darkened living room, his face pale, his hands resting motionless on his knees. Hours passed as he stared at nothing, his mind locked in a haze where fear, desperation, and determination blended together. What he had once seen as an unthinkable act now seemed to him like an inevitable conclusion. Upstairs, Claire and the children slept soundly, unaware of the storm that had fully formed in Paul's head. The hallway was quiet, lined with family photos that captured smiles and laughter from brighter days. Each image showed what life had been before the layoffs, before the secret shame, before the silence had consumed their home. Paul moved slowly, his footsteps careful, almost deliberate, as if he feared waking the memories rather than the people. His heart pounded with a steady rhythm, but his face showed no emotion. He had become eerily calm, as though his decision had silenced the chaos inside him. He entered the children's rooms first, their small bodies curled beneath blankets, safe in their dreams. The innocence of their faces, peaceful and unaware, should have stopped him. Yet Paul's thoughts twisted the scene into something else. He convinced himself that he was saving them from the pain of growing up in ruin, from the humiliation of poverty, from a life where their father had failed them. The act itself was quick, cold, and final. He left no chance for them to wake, no moment of fear, only silence where there had once been soft breathing. Claire was next. She stirred faintly as he approached, but not enough to open her eyes. She had endured weeks of tension, carrying the burden of unspoken worry, trying to keep her family afloat while Paul drifted further into darkness. He ended her life with the same chilling composure he had shown moments before. When it was over, the house was quieter than it had ever been. The walls seemed to absorb the weight of what had happened, every shadow now heavier, every corner tainted by the irreversible. Paul returned to the living room and sank back into the same chair he had occupied earlier, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Around him lay the silence of a home that would never again know laughter, argument, or routine. His plan was complete, and yet there was no relief in his eyes. He sat for hours, frozen, staring at the dim light filtering through the curtains, as though waiting for something to happen. In that chair, surrounded by the remnants of a family he had destroyed, Paul confronted the final step he had always known would come. The decision he had carried in his heart for weeks now turned inward, and the weight of his despair pushed him toward the last act he would ever commit. The following morning began like any other in the neighborhood. Children walked to school with backpacks bouncing, dogs barked from behind fences, and commuters hurried toward their daily routines. But the Anderson house remained strangely still. The curtains were drawn tight, no movement came from inside, and the family car never pulled out of the driveway. Neighbors noticed, but at first, they brushed it off. Perhaps Claire had taken the children somewhere, or Paul had driven them quietly before dawn. By midday, however, unease began to spread. Claire never missed her morning shift at the library without calling. The children were rarely absent from school. The silence around the house began to feel unnatural. By early afternoon, one concerned neighbor approached the front door and knocked. No footsteps echoed from inside, no voice called back, not even the bark of the family dog, which had once greeted visitors with enthusiasm. After a few attempts, the neighbor stepped back, unsettled by the heavy quiet. By evening, another neighbor made the decision to call the police, unable to shake the sense that something was terribly wrong. When officers arrived, they knocked loudly and announced themselves. The lack of response confirmed their suspicions, and soon they forced their way into the home. The first thing they noticed was the unnatural stillness, a kind of silence that seemed too complete, as if the house itself held its breath. Moving carefully from room to room, the officers discovered the grim truth. Upstairs, the children were found in their beds, their small forms unmoving beneath the blankets. There were no signs of struggle, no indication they had even been aware of the danger that came for them in the night. In another room, Claire lay as if she had simply drifted deeper into sleep. But the investigators recognized the signs immediately. Her life had been taken in the same cold manner as her children. The air grew heavier with every discovery, the officers' faces hardening as they processed the horror of what had unfolded within these walls. Finally, they entered the living room. There sat Paul, slumped in a chair, his body lifeless, his head bowed as though in defeat. Near him lay the means by which he had ended his own life. The scene was chilling not only for its brutality, but for its calmness. There had been no chaos, no frantic attempt at escape, just a methodical destruction of an entire family, followed by the father's own quiet end. The officers radioed in the scene, their voices steady but weighted with shock. Soon the house filled with investigators, photographers, and medical examiners. Each detail was carefully documented, though everyone present knew the larger story was one of despair rather than mystery. Outside, word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Curious onlookers gathered near the yellow police tape, their faces pale as they whispered about the family they had thought they knew. Parents pulled their children closer, and friends exchanged horrified glances. The Anderson home, once just another house on a quiet street, had become the site of a tragedy that no one would ever forget. News of the Anderson tragedy spread rapidly, first across the neighborhood, then the town, and soon through the entire state. Reporters arrived within hours of the discovery, their vans lined up along the street, lights flashing against the somber backdrop of police cars. The once ordinary cul-de-sac was transformed into a scene of chaos, filled with cameras, notepads, and hushed conversations. Neighbors who had once waved at the Andersons on their morning walks now stood behind barriers, shaken and bewildered, trying to piece together how such devastation could unfold in a house they thought was filled with love. Friends of Claire described her as warm, dependable, and devoted to her children. Colleagues at the library wept as they spoke of her kindness, remembering how she helped patrons find books, organized events for children, and always wore a gentle smile. The children's teachers shared stories of their laughter in the classroom, their eagerness to learn, and the way they had proudly spoken of their parents. To those who knew them, the family had seemed normal, even happy. It was unthinkable that behind their closed doors lay such deep fractures that would end in murder. Attention quickly turned to Paul. Former co-workers recalled a quiet man who showed up on time and rarely complained. Some said he had seemed more withdrawn after the layoffs, but no one imagined he was capable of violence. Investigators uncovered the foreclosure notices, the unpaid bills, and the job applications that had gone unanswered. They pieced together the final months of his life, tracing a path of silence and isolation that led to his deadly decision. Psychologists interviewed by the media pointed to financial despair, pride, and untreated mental strain as possible triggers. Yet explanations offered little comfort. The reality was that a father had destroyed his family, and no amount of analysis could erase that truth. In the days that followed, the Anderson home stood abandoned, its windows dark, its front lawn unkempt as police tape fluttered in the wind. Flowers, candles, and stuffed animals began to appear on the sidewalk, left by mourners who struggled to express their grief. Some left notes addressed to Claire and the children, words of sorrow and prayers for peace. Others left messages questioning how such a tragedy could have been prevented. The display grew into a memorial, a silent testament to the lives that had been taken. The funeral was held quietly, attended by extended family, close friends, and townspeople who felt compelled to show their respect. The coffins were small, lined up in a row that tore at the hearts of everyone present. As the service ended, the weight of what had been lost pressed heavily on the room. An entire family was gone, not by accident or illness, but by the deliberate hand of the man who should have been their protector. In time, the news cycle moved on, but the memory of the Andersons remained. The boarded-up house still stands, a dark silhouette among the tidy homes around it. Those who drive past rarely speak, but all who see it remember. For many, it is more than a tragedy. It is a warning of how despair left unchecked can turn into something monstrous, leaving scars that a community carries long after the headlines fade.